I'm going to talk about patriotic covers. Um, those of you who arrived early heard the story already. The picture on the upper right corner is the cover of a scrapbook that was assembled by one Hiram Rusa, who was the corresponding secretary of the New York Military Association, a prolific collector. The collection includes original correspondence, souvenirs people sent him, newspaper clippings. Most importantly, for our purposes, of probably 300 plus mint condition patriotic covers. It came to my attention, a cousin I was talking with, regrettably, we do not share this ancestor, but he became aware from our talks that I was a Civil War nut, and offered to loan me this thing. And it is an absolutely fascinating collection, some of which we'll talk about tonight. Now, when I collected stamps when I was a kid, my budget was very small. I never was really, in the market for anything much more valuable than like a plate block of 4. Every time I looked at my stamp collection, it was a little history and geography lesson and current events even. This shows, the national parks and the series, the Occupied Country series, were two particular favorites. But it was, I was struck, like I'd look at my mom's collection from the 20s and mine from the 50s, and why are there countries in hers that aren't in mine? And, questions like that. Everybody who's collected stamps, I'm sure, is, I'm saying things that are trite. My little Operation Deep Freeze envelope that I waited a couple of years breathlessly for. Things my mom had the first airmail flight out of our hometown, mail that you got from other people. Someone was in Switzerland and knew we were interested in stamps, an old franked envelope from my dad to his parents. But one way you can look at stamps is rarity, condition, and all of that. The other way is they're little history and geography lessons. That's a little background to a reflection about that I went through again about 5 years ago when I became acquainted with patriotic covers. I'm going to cover a number of topics tonight. First, just some who's and what's, and then quickly walk through lightly, just top down presentation of the issues. More about the covers. This is not a Civil War lecture. It's about covers, showing how they reflected the content they reflected, the heroes, the martyrs, the triumphs, the trash talk about the other side. And then a number of kind of, you look at the cover and you say, what the heck is this one about? Little detective stories that I had the fun of chasing down. Not going to do a heck of a lot of background, but one thing, the Civil War was the first war where public opinion mattered. The scale of it, the money, the casualty lists, the opinions of people. The Revolutionary War, of course, broadly, if the public didn't support it, the revolution would die. But the army was primarily the people who were directly involved in the war. From the Civil War on, the public is involved. Um, Patriotic covers, as I was getting more and more immersed in them, the first thing I concluded was, gee, these would make pretty good illustrations for an illustrated history of the period. And then as I got deeper and deeper into it, it became more profound than that. There were no public opinion polls, but the covers provide pretty good insights. Obviously, the printers made them to make money. If they produced one on a topic and it didn't sell, they're not going to produce a third, a fourth, a fifth, and a sixth on that topic. If you go on eBay and every night there's a particular cover, obviously, you know, that one must have sold pretty well. It's a pretty good guide to at least what people were thinking about. I loved it that, you know, over 100 years apart, two quotes from the Philatelic Society magazine, both basically making the same point, and the point that, you know, occurred to me that it's an insight into what's on the public's mind. The most common topic, I would say, is just a sort of hooray for our side. You know, no particular point other than to say good for us. Very different approaches of the two sides. The Union, it's red, white, and blue. The flag, nationalist heroes like Washington, Jackson, Daniel Webster, the Constitution, the laws, symbols like the Liberty Bell, Old Ironsides, Independence Hall, Mount Vernon, things like that. And the message of all of them, obviously, the Union is permanent and indivisible. It will not surprise you, I imagine, to know the Confederacy's message was not that the Union is permanent and indivisible. And they did not draw their authority. They did not call back to the Constitution. They called back to the Declaration of Independence. Obviously, the right of the people to alter or abolish an oppressive government it's going to be a more important theme for them than for the United States. Washington is a person they cite as an authority, but not a quote from the farewell address about, you know, national harmony. The fact that he was a rebel is the point they find important. That one on the left, the palmetto tree, of course, is a symbol of South Carolina. The quote, the last line of the Declaration of Independence is, "We pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." So that clearly any educated person would have recognized that as a reference back to the Declaration of Independence. I don't know why they thought South Carolina was in the Rocky Mountains, but the meaning of that one's pretty unmistakable. Similarly, the one on the upper right is a reference back to Ben Franklin's famous join or die from the colonial era. That's one, by the way, we can date probably to about a 2-week period. It's an appeal to the southern states to join together and form a nation. That had already happened by mid-February of 1861. And on, say, January 1st, 1861, there wasn't enough seceded states to appeal to. So that's when we can say somewhere between mid-January and mid-February. You could probably narrow it down even closer than that. The Confederates, many fewer, and they had a style a little more pugnacious. Not surprising, I suppose, given that they're a brand new country and they're, you know, they start out, the first national act they have to do is repel an invasion. A lot of what we'd recognize in current events as kind of Tea Party themes, Don't Tread on Us. Obviously, Sic Semper Tyrannis was then and is still the motto of the state of Virginia. Jefferson Davis was himself an important nationalist figure. The one on the lower right, nailing the flag to the mast. The way a ship captain surrenders is he strikes the colors. So if he nails the flag to the mast, basically he's saying this is a fight to the death. The wording on that one, which is kind of runs off the bottom, is death before dishonor. Now, this one I'm going to address on the next slide because it makes a point about the covers. There were, I think in the North, there were 5 really big printers who dominated. There were many other small ones, but Magnus McGee and a couple others dominated the market. They tended to reuse the same image over and over and over again. And here's a case where they even used it to switch sides. The original story is obviously a pro-union message. But the 7-star flag, that was the Confederacy from February to May 1861 consisted of 7 states. So that is the first Confederate flag. It's obviously the same printer, the same basic plate with just, one redo, but you will see the same image with different text. I did not realize this for quite a long while, but much of the covers aimed at a Southern audience was printed in the North. Much higher quality printing, obviously much better access to ink and paper. The market for both died out by, say, mid-1862. But the Southern market for covers tailed off much more quickly than in the North because, everything was increasingly in short supply. For that reason, if you wanted to be the subject of a cover, you'd better do your work early in the Civil War. I've not found a single cover on the Battle of Gettysburg. I've not found a single cover about Robert E. Lee, William Sherman. The folks who finished the Civil War don't appear. Whereas George McClellan, who was briefly the most prominent guy in the country, but had faded away and was out of the Army a year and a half after the war started. There's many, many covers about him. You'll notice the soldier figures, Battle of Mill Springs, Kentucky. If you've never heard of Mill Springs, don't feel bad. I never heard of it until I saw this cover. But it was, as it happens, the first Union land victory in the Civil War. And there's more covers about that fairly obscure little battle than there are about Gettysburg and every battle after Gettysburg combined. So let's go through just a quick history. Very quick here. 1860 election, most important one ever. 4 candidates, the Democrats shattered into 3 pieces. Lost 11 of the next 13 president elections. Lincoln won with less than 40% of the popular vote. Breckinridge, the sitting vice president and the most militant of the 4 candidates, was runner-up. The mere election of Lincoln was enough to drive 7 states out of the Union. 8 other border states remained for now. The first action a southern state took after it left, in fact, some did it before, was there are federal forts, customs houses, mints, various federal facilities, arsenals. You're trespassing on our property, President Buchanan. That's the property of the sovereign nation of South Carolina now. So please leave our property. Most of these forts would be defended by 30 men led by a captain. They're in no position to fight. Most fell quickly. The point of confrontation became Fort Sumter, Charleston Harbor. That situation was allowed to drift. Frankly, nobody was in a hurry to start the war today. The people of South Carolina went to President Buchanan and said, "You're on our property, you got to get out, but long as you don't reinforce, resupply, we won't push the issue today." Buchanan, of course, all he wants to do is retire and go home. So the situation is allowed to drift for months. What finally brings it to a head is the commander writes Lincoln and says, "Mr. President, I'm running out of supplies, and if I'm not resupplied, I'll have to surrender." Lincoln realizes that would not be a good look, so he sends a supply expedition, more or less maneuvers the Confederacy into having to fire on the fort. That happened early April 1861. The fort held out for 36 hours and then drew down the flag. The North, to use a clinical term, went nuts. Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Of course, Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas are still states of the Union, so they get that letter requesting soldiers. Their governors don't like that. And that sets off secession crises in the remaining slave states of the Union. Until Fort Sumter happened. I mean, the first state left in December. Fort Sumter happened in April. It was a bit like the period, anybody who follows World War II, the so-called phony war. You know, everybody declared war on Hitler in September 39 when he invaded Poland, but until May 1940, nothing happened other than Hitler gobbling up Poland. And this was one between the states starting to secede and Fort Sumter was a nearly 6-month period where really nothing happened. Many people in the North thought this is just going to blow over. We have these crises every 5 years now. And everybody says all sorts of crazy things, and eventually somebody works it out. It'll blow over again. And many of the covers sort of reflect that. General Scott, Winfield Scott, the general-in-chief, saying, "I don't think it's even worth using this candle snuffer. I think it'll just burn itself out." Again, I'm being repetitive here. I didn't realize that. Columbia awake at last, reflecting the idea that she's been slumbering. You'll see the quote, "by the eternal," on the lower right. That's a famous Andrew Jackson quote. He gave a famous toast during an earlier secession crisis. "By the eternal, the Union must and shall be preserved." So we're keeping up on, making references to nationalist authorities that the people will recognize. The border states, a great story. I mentioned that just briefly when I first signed on. Just a phenomenally high level of political skullduggery. Larger than life characters. Each of the 7 states is this, there were 8 of them, but Delaware was never in play. Particularly Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri. The political maneuvering to keep them in the Union was pretty profound. The covers, a lot of humor in the covers. The upper right one, Jefferson Davis is the spider. Skull and crossbones is a frequent theme with Davis. And you can see that the Alabamas, the Georgias, the Mississippis, the Texases are already impaled. He's just grabbed Virginia. That would make this around May 1861. And Maryland and Missouri are thinking about it. Walk into my parlor, says the spider to the fly. And Missouri tasting secession soup and gets burnt, thinks she won't go in. I have a whole lecture on the secession crisis in the border states. There's that much material. I believe, among other things, this was the critical decision of the war. The 4 states that left doubled the population of the Confederate States of America, more than doubled the industry, significantly moved the border north by 200 to 300 miles. I mean, the 7-state Confederacy, the United States of America, starts out about 100 miles from Birmingham. Now you've got Virginia, Tennessee, many other things, but also just as a physical buffer. The upper right, one of my favorites. Again, JD, you can see the brand on his leg, and again, the skull and crossbones. Jefferson Davis carrying the dead birds, Tennessee and Virginia, to Dixie's land. 3 stayed in. Kentucky, undoubtedly, that was a genuine reflection of the public will. There was a deal of maneuvering, but if you look at the documents, it seems pretty evident that their decision was genuinely a reflection of what the citizens of Kentucky wanted to do. Maryland and Missouri, nobody will ever know whether that's the case, because the degree of political coercion was so great. The decisions, a lot of public opinion was suppressed, including in Maryland, by arresting half the legislature. You can see upper right, Governor Bank, Nathaniel Banks was the military governor of Maryland. Winfield Scott, the general in chief, saying, just chain up that dog Baltimore until he behaves himself. The lower right, a riff on the original Missouri Compromise from 1820. But this is our Missouri Compromise, a cannonball, shooting at you rebels. Once, these are not covers, these are illustrations from Harper's Weekly. Once those states left, one of the first moves, the precious resources in Virginia, the Harper's Ferry Arsenal, the Norfolk Navy Yard, the United States forces attempted to burn both and scuttle the ships in the Navy Yard. Unsuccessful. Most of the production equipment from both facilities and most of the inventory was salvaged. But early in 1861, it's largely, things are going the South's way. 1862, the worm utterly reverses itself. Early 1862 was a tremendous losing streak for the Confederacy. Reference to Western Virginia, the upper right, the Western colonies, the secession vote in Virginia was 88-55 to go out. Those 55 were almost entirely from the Western colonies, what now is the state of West Virginia. The Appalachian Mountains, this was true in Tennessee, this was true in North Carolina as well. There was no fondness for slavery in the mountain areas, not conducive to plantation agriculture, Small farms, primarily Scotch-Irish, not English Cavalier, Baptist and Methodist, not church. These were culturally and economically very different places. And in, of course, the state in the Virginia, they organized the state and left. And a clever cover, the sturdy yeoman from West Virginia, trying to stop that stubborn mule, Eastern Virginia, from jumping off a cliff. Northern printers feeling their oats after this string of victories. The shavings and the can't do it A are all references to Union triumphs early in 1862. A little maybe premature celebration in memory of the downfall of the rebellion. Those examples there around the star, again, all are early 1862. My histories of the Civil War say the war went on another 3 full years. So anybody thinking that Fort Henry, Roanoke, Mill Spring, Savannah, and Fort Donelson were leading to the downfall of the rebellion was probably being a little bit premature. You do, before the covers fade out, mid 1862, you do start to see some signs of war weariness. You know, they're not called patriotic covers for no reason. These are patriotic covers. Go team, go. We'll see a lot of examples of the go team, go. But the one on the right, when I first saw it, I practically fell out of my chair. I have no hesitation in saying, and I say it boldly, this Civil War is ruinous. The one on the right is not so much anti-war, it's how much we're all one people and truly love each other. And what a great day it will be when we're one again and can begin reconciling. The casualty number, I mean, much is made. I mean, everybody, when they marched to Manassas Junction, Virginia, and fought what became the first Battle of Bull Run or First Manassas, depending on your preference. Everybody basically thought, you know, got to make it to that battle because that's my chance. This war is going to be one battle long. By 1862, it's dawning on people. This war is probably going to last a little while, as indeed it did. So, getting into more of the covers and away from the history, I apologize for maybe a little bit of inside baseball for those who are not specifically Civil War buffs. I mainly want to talk about the covers, and from here on, it'll be that. The first hero of the Civil War, this was one of the first covers in the collection that really drew my attention, sort of what's this? If anyone attempts to haul down the American flag, shoot him on the spot, John A. Dix. Well, first of all, who's John A. Dix? And second of all, what's he talking about? Well, thanks to Google, I mean, back when I was looking in my stamp collection, I had the World Book, which was the 50s equivalent of Google, I guess. But John Dix, a New York politician, he was the lame duck Secretary of the Treasury for Buchanan because a Southerner left to go south. He's trying to protect the revenue. He sends orders to all of his revenue cutter captains in the South, get your boats to a safe place. He hears that this captain in New Orleans hasn't done it, and he sends this telegram ordering people to arrest that captain and that colorful expression. Some telegraph operator in the South, instead of transmitting it on, transmits it to the newspapers. And it became one of the first cause celebs. This is January 1861. 6 months before the shooting started. So John Dix became one of the first people the newspapers in the North sort of celebrated as, a go-getter kind of guy. The early martyrs, until the casualty lists got so long that there were too many to handle. These were four of the earliest, where the casualties in any given engagement are, the fingers of two hands. No, I mean, the point of it is that they were celebrating the martyrs, not so much who each individual one was. Colonel E.D. Baker is the only sitting U.S. senator who fell in the Civil War. He was wearing two hats. He was both a colonel of volunteers and a sitting U.S. senator and a personal friend of Lincoln's. And that was a national story when he died. Why should, if you ever look at covers, if you ever peruse eBay, it seems sometimes like 1 out of 10 of them say, remember Ellsworth, who, again, one of the first, scratch your head, what's this? Who's Ellsworth and why should I remember him? Ellsworth was a friend of Lincoln's, commanded a regiment of soldiers, volunteers. The first offensive move of the war. Troops moved from Washington across the river to occupy Arlington and Alexandria. That was easily done. The Confederate troops had fled. But there was a hotel in Alexandria that had a Confederate flag flying from it. Ellsworth appointed himself to the mission to go haul down that flag, which he did, but encountered the hotel owner, who was an ardent secessionist, who gunned him down and promptly was gunned down by someone in Ellsworth's party. I'm trying to think of an analogy. Maybe if, say in World War II, Patton, Eisenhower, and Bradley had all been killed in the same plane crash in terms of the national impact of this. He was the first officer to die, and the fact he was already a national celebrity added to that. His body lay in state at the White House. The funeral parade, Lincoln personally marched behind his casket. And as this is, other than trash talking Jefferson Davis, Ellsworth is probably the most popular topic of a patriotic cover. Again, once you're having casualties in the thousands, we just don't have the attention span to individually mourn anybody. The guy who gunned him down also became a martyr in the South. They, of course, considered this, a brutal invasion, and Ellsworth got exactly what he deserved. The contrabands. This is interesting. The standard line on the Civil War is Lincoln came to making it an anti-slavery crusade reluctantly. At first, there was no thought of official war aims of freeing the slaves. It was just to preserve the Union, and that many people in the North were not supportive of the idea of freeing the slaves. Benjamin Butler, not much of a general, but a smart trial lawyer, wearing 2 stars on his shoulder as a general at the time. May 61. Again, this is all stuff before the shooting has started. He's the new commander at Fort Monroe. 3 slaves made their way from the Confederate lines into the fort. The standing policy of the United States is don't interfere with local institutions, which means send slaves back if they come into your camp. Butler cleverly finesses this issue of freeing slaves. He simply says, I'm confiscating them as sort of war property, contraband of war. Like if he would, you wouldn't criticize me if there's a cannon shooting at me and I confiscate it. I mean, and these guys were digging trenches for those cannon, and I'm confiscating them and going to keep them. Lincoln's cabinet thinks about it, writes this carefully written letter. Don't go crazy, but if slaves make it to your lines, you're authorized to keep them. That is the beginning of the end for slavery, because the word that is the Union policy passed to, slave camps throughout the South, seemingly within seconds, and the flood was on. But the point that I find interesting is hugely common topic. Again, reminder, second and third covers on a topic don't get printed if the first one didn't sell well. And what makes them sell well, obviously, is people are interested. They like that cover. Clearly, there's no question. Nobody would argue that the attitude of Northerners towards individual enslaved people was in any way enlightened. But they were really intrigued by this idea of slaves escaping and coming, us taking slaves away from the South. And that might have been just kind of a military calculation. The more of them we get away from them, the quicker this war will be over. But I have to think partly that was a thinking that, this slavery thing, I don't much like it. And if these folks are taking the effort to run away, good for them. But there are, again, number one is Jefferson Davis. Number two is Elmer Ellsworth. Contraband might be the third most common topic of covers. You'll note the exaggerated features, the patois. They're not treating the slaves as real peers of us. They're just treating them as individuals that we're happy they're on our side and not on the other side. Going through a few people, George McClellan, any Civil War student would find the one on the left pretty funny. George McClellan saying, we have beat our last retreat. He was the first military hero, ran a successful campaign in Western Virginia, became in charge of Union armies in the East, and Lincoln's criticism was he has a case of the slows. He pretty much did nothing but retreat the rest of the war and was gone quickly. This is in the category, you'll see a lot if you peruse covers, references to Floyd or to theft. Floyd was a past governor of Virginia. He was Buchanan's Secretary of War, not much of an administrator. He was accused of corrupt handling of some Indian trust fund money. He was ultimately acquitted of that. When the secession crisis started, every state was entitled to a quota of munitions for their militia. He expedited shipment of massive quantities of armament from northern arsenals to the South. A big part of why the Confederacy could arm their initial armies was Floyd's extraordinary efforts to get the money to them. An object of scorn, and all of the references have something to do with theft, or, you can see the rifled muskets, the upper right, the lead rat is Floyd, etc. Beauregard, I love these. Greatest name of any Civil War person, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. He was in charge of military affairs in Charleston. So he was the military commander who fired on Fort Sumter. And Jefferson Davis, he's not a man who showed a lot of sense of humor. but he supposedly wrote this little ditty. The final lines: Fort Sumter is ours and nobody hurt. We tender old Abe Lincoln our beau regard. And the Northern printers just had a field day with playing on words of bore regard, blow regard, etc. On the blow is a common put down of the era. Good on the blow in context seems to be kind of all talk, no action. He's good on the blow, but doesn't really get anything done. Many covers making references to debts, bonds, loans. The Confederacy's finances were always pretty sketchy and got sketchier as the war went on. Basically, you didn't have an income. The main income for the United States and its subordinate parts was duties on imports, secondarily excise taxes. The main income that a Confederate States of America not at war has is going to be taxes on the cultivation and export sale of cotton. The blockade obviously cut that off. So that the South's national income is virtually nothing. And so to an unusual extent, really from the beginning, they had to rely on bonds, borrowing money. And this obviously, as the war went on and they lost more property and it finally became pretty evident they weren't going to win. Obviously, who wants to loan money to a country that's not going to be viable? Anyway, if you page through eBay, the 50 pages of covers on eBay tonight or any other night, you'd probably find 20, 30 generally poking fun at the South and their sketchy finances. The other sort of political topic, closely related, is their diplomatic efforts. Obviously, the South, many Southerners convinced themselves no shots would be fired because the prospect of the industrial powers of Europe losing access to Southern cotton was so great that Britain and France notably, would instantly step in on the South side and say to Lincoln, hey, figure out a way to work this out, because if you're going to make war against our friends, you're going to be making war against us. That, of course, never materialized. But poking fun at their diplomatic efforts, like the commissioners of the CSA at foreign courts in the upper left, or poking fun at Britain, the perception of Britain as being, sort of greedy and obsessed with cotton. A few detective stories. These are the fun ones. What the heck does this one mean? If you, peruse the set of covers, the expression "let me alone," especially if Jefferson Davis is in the picture. I only want to be left alone. This was one of these that I phrased to myself. What the heck's that mean? Turns out Jefferson Davis's first message to the Confederate Congress, a totally reasonable and statesmanlike speech. We come to this, exactly what you'd expect a politician to say. We come to this reluctantly. We're not angry at the United States. We'd like to live in peace with them. But if it's going to be a war, bring it on. But at one point he says, as is quoted here, we seek no conquest, no concession. All we ask is to be let alone. Well, the Northern printers just couldn't let that one be. And They tormented Davis. Most of those show him sort of cowering with some sort of He-Man Northerner kind of, you know, about to beat him up, and he's cowering away and saying, "Let me alone, let me alone." An example of how eminently reasonable words can come back and haunt you. Three that kind of tied together. The very first Confederate privateer, that was privately owned ships that were given a license to prey on merchant shipping of the other side, things that would be piracy if they didn't have that license. The second ship he attacked was a U.S. warship. That wasn't a good move. He was captured. Lincoln says the first few crews, there's, I think, 15 men who are going on trial. And he says, I want them to be tried as pirates, which means if they're convicted, they'll be executed. Jefferson Davis orders his people to take an equivalent number of prisoners who were taken at Bull Run and other battles, take them from the prisoner camp to a dungeon, and writes a letter to Lincoln saying, okay, if you go down that road, I'll go down that road with you, man for man. You're really sure you want to do this, Abe? Probably the first act of national statecraft the Confederate States of America did. Lincoln, of course, thought better of it. Backed down, said, okay, treat them as, combatants, hold them as prisoners until they're exchanged. One of the covers in Roos's collection, Corcoran, he was commander of a New York regiment. He was one of the prisoners. And of course, the one on the lower right shows, the Union prisoners being held in the dungeon. This is a verse, you read that, strike till the last armed foe expires, strike for your old. You read that and you say, that was not copy that just some printer wrote to be a way cool caption for an envelope. That was written by a poet. That comes from a poem. So you go to Google and you look it up. Turns out European liberation movements were very popular. Garibaldi was conducting the Italian Risorgimento, the reunification war, at exactly the same time, and northern and southern newspapers avidly followed his progress. Turns out that verse is from a poem about a Greek freedom fighter of the 1830s. This was his inspiring speech to his men before they attacked a Turkish camp. He fell in that battle. The verse, I've also found that verse on recruitment posters. It's pretty cool, get a young man fired up language. What's up with these colorful uniforms? The Zouaves. They were an elite unit in the French army. Actually, Elmer Ellsworth, mentioned earlier, is the man who brought the Zouave concept to the US. Before the war, these were very elite groups. They trained, they fought differently. They double quicked into combat. They fought in dispersed formations. It was a real point of pride to be in a Zouave unit, sort of like probably being a Marine now. Slightly higher on the pecking order than Army. So you'll see a lot of the early mobilizing units were Zouaves. So a lot of the covers have them. This one really, I might cut it off shortly. I think I probably running close to time, but Governor Letcher bringing in clothes stolen from Union ladies. What the heck is that about? Maybe a metaphor for, stealing things. Harper's Ferry, I don't know. Well, I looked and it's not a metaphor for anything. It's actually a real story. Governor Letcher, Virginia governor, when Norfolk Naval Base was evacuated, a naval officer's wife deposited her belongings at an express office, and they never made it to her. And she wrote this nice letter to the governor, just saying, Governor, I'd appreciate it if you could have one of your aides look into it and see if my belongings could be forwarded to me. Here's my address. Thank you, sir. And this aide, I mean, it was, I was in politics for a while, and politicians don't write letters this snotty, but one of his aides wrote this letter and says, we hear that you denounced your son because he sided with, his home state, Virginia, and the Confederacy. So here's what we think we're going to do. We're just going to keep your clothes and we're going to give them to your son and he can sell them. So take that. And the correspondence, she and her husband wrote insisting they had not denounced their son, whatever, and were on fine terms with him. And the correspondence went back and forth for a while. And the northern newspapers just loved this example of, small-minded governor of Virginia. I do not know if the woman ever got her clothes back. This was actually the first of these, what the heck is going on with this story? Captain Thomas, his new position in the Naval Bureau, a French lady. What? Again, pre-Manassas, the shooting hasn't started yet. A French lady gets on a Chesapeake Bay steamer and says to the captain, you can see her with her parasol and waving her fan saying, I'm feeling ill, I'm going to go to my cabin. Another stop, about a dozen mechanics get on, finishing their job, heading home. Before they get to port, these people present themselves to the captain. It turns out it's a colonel and a bunch of sailors from the Confederate Navy. They seize the ship. They spend a few days preying on Chesapeake Bay shipping, send about 3 or 4 ships to the Confederacy. He becomes a minor celebrity, banquets in his honor and stuff like that. And again, the war is being treated more like March Madness at this point. It's fun still. The stories are interesting, not tragic. Even the northern newspapers were slightly amused by the escapades of Captain Thomas. He went to do it again, got caught. When the northern troops came on to arrest him, he went and hid in a bureau, which is where the imagery of the envelope comes from. Any that need to be, the commerce. These stories are, I developed a book. The book is not a postal history book. It's a history of the secession crisis and the onset of the Civil War. It does, over the course of the book, it explains the background, the context of probably 300 covers. Let me back up because I skipped. The point is, each one of those covers has a story. Most of the write-ups on eBay I see just take the wording on the cover and cite it and talk about mint condition or who it was addressed to, collectible type information, evaluating it as collectibles. I think there is also a vast opportunity. And I mean, I've spent a lifetime studying the Civil War, but you don't have to have spent a lifetime studying the Civil War. There is a real opportunity to use the covers, as I made reference talking about my stamp collection, as little insights into the Civil War, and insights into what was on the public's mind. I think for those who are collecting the covers, It's a way to sort of expand not the monetary value, but expand the personal value of your collection. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
On the last slide that you showed, there was a reference to break dancing. What is that in reference to?
John C. Breckinridge. He was James Buchanan. He was the immediate past vice president of the United States in the Buchanan administration. Still the youngest vice president ever. He was like 34 years old. No, couldn't have been. I think 36. Pretty much the constitutional minimum. He was the runner-up in the 1860 presidential election. He was the most militant of the four candidates, not a secessionist, just the most firm that the southern states are going to insist on their rights. And he also, in the 1860, well, I guess no, you didn't have elections for Senate. The state legislature of Kentucky had elected him to the U.S. Senate. So as the secession crisis was unfolding, he's a sitting U.S. senator. And he made much, as Kentucky is making much. Should I stay? Should I go? So that is Jefferson Davis saying, you know, Breckinridge is my little puppet. I can make him do whatever I want. He'll dance whatever tune I tell him to dance to. Now, Robert E. Lee is the one that most often is cited as an example. Southern office holders or military officers who were confronted with this choice. Should I go with my oath, or should I go with my state? Lee chose his state. There are a great many Southerners who stayed with it. It divided families. Breckinridge, you know, Kentucky stayed in the Union. So Breckinridge, you know, not to put too harsh, well, to put a harsh expression on it, he betrayed his state and his oath. He went contrary to what the state did. Andrew Johnson, later in the second election, Lincoln's vice presidential candidate, he was the only one of the, I guess it would have been 22 sitting U.S. senators from a seceding state who did not resign from the Senate. That's why he became Lincoln's vice presidential candidate. He was from Tennessee. He was a horrible man, a lout, a drunk. But politically, back in the days when you didn't think so much of, like George Bush looked on Dick Cheney not only as a person politically valuable to me, but also as a man who's going to significantly help me run the country. And that's become the common thing recently. Back then, even as recently as 1960, JFK and LBJ, vice presidents were just to help you get elected, to ensure you some particular constituency. But anyway, the other Southern senators all eventually went south.
Terrific, thank you.
Yeah, one of them I skipped over him, Wigfall. He was one of the fire eaters. That's the really, most Southerners at the beginning of 1860, even the day of the 1860 election, they had not firmly said, I'm seceding, I'm ready to go. You know, they wanted to defend their rights, And many of them were increasingly depressed about the possibility of doing that in the context of the Union. But as I said, even Breckinridge, the most militant of the four, didn't say, if we lose, we're leaving. There was a group called the Fire Eaters. They knew the path they were on for at least 5 years. This Wigfall was a fire eater. You know, he's actively working to bring on the end of the Union. He was a senator from Texas. But when Texas seceded, he just stayed seated in the Senate, voting on things. And he was very open about the fact he was reporting back to the Confederate government things he observed in Washington. But they did finally expel him. And then he became first a brigade commander and then a senator for the Confederacy.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, Leon, we'd really like to thank you tonight. It's a really interesting perspective. Really appreciate you sharing your covers, and it's a little bit different presentation where the illustrations were the focus, not the, you know, like we say, always doing the postal part of it.
Yeah,
that was very
I
interesting.
realize it's a little bit contrary to the typical form, but I do think it's another thing that just adds interest and value to your collection. If I still remember Sucre La Paz. You know, why is that country in my stamp collector album? Why do they list two capitals for that country? The geographical and historical trivia I stored up staring at stamps as a young collector, learning about Laos and, you know, Belgian Congo and, you know, all
Sure.
the hot spots in the late 50s and early 60s. So I'm on a little bit of a mission to convert people to that.
Well, we do have a question in the chat there. It says from Danny, which covers would you consider as more rare than others? Said he has a nice Winfield Scott, but rather new to collecting, you know, military covers.
Yeah, Winfield Scott. He was the general in chief. He was War of 1812 veteran. He had been general in chief for something like 25 years. His best days were well beyond him. But he was a military genius. He put together the initial defenses and then got supplanted pretty quickly by younger and more energetic men. But early on, when the covers were being printed in big volumes, he was a popular theme. So he's probably, it's not likely a cover of him would be tremendously rare. As a broad categorization, Confederate covers tend to be rarer. They weren't produced in the same quantity to begin with. Plus, you know, things were just more chaotic. People were less likely to, you know, to sort of have the time and attention span for a collection. The postal, as more and more territory fell to the Union, the area covered by the postal system was less and less. There, you can see there are two. Most covers are really designed. They're done by a professional print shop. But there are many covers that really have kind of an amateurish look to them, more hand-drawn. I think a lot of them are on the rarer side. Again, it's either being done by a very small print shop that doesn't have a professional designer and maybe only printing 10 to begin with. So if you're on the lookout for those would be two. But specific ones, I can't really. I mean, there are. This is somewhat wild guess. there are probably at least 10,000 covers. If someone told me there were 50,000, I wouldn't bet any money against them if they sounded like they knew what they were talking about. There are just a lot of covers out there.
It looked like the printing companies in New York and Philadelphia were just cranking them out.
Yeah,
See a lot of those.
Magnus, McGee also, he was in Philly. He had a sideline. He also printed counterfeit Confederate money, which initially he claimed he was selling as it was not a difficult challenge. Again, the Confederacy just didn't have the printing equipment and technology to print high security bills. They're pretty amateurish themselves. He claimed he was doing it as souvenirs, but eventually he admitted that he understood these people coming in and buying $5,000 worth of souvenir currency were probably taking it to Louisville to buy cotton with it. I actually ran into a scholarly article in a journal that estimated that the quantity of the counterfeit currency produced by Northern printers probably amounted to 5 to 6% of the Confederate paper money supply. So they contributed in a small way to the rampant inflation in the South.
It's funny because we were talking about the collectability and the value. I wonder if the covers are worth more now than the money that was printed.
I'm surprised that money, there's so much of it around. It's so perishable. Roos's scrapbook has probably 20 pieces of paper money that some New York soldier sent to him. And they are really in rough shape because you can see that the printing was not great quality. The paper was not great quality. But there's a lot of money around.
It's always something neat to collect. Anybody have anything else for Leon? Well, I'd really like to thank you for presenting tonight. It's really been awesome. I really appreciate it.
I enjoyed it. This was my first go out of the box with this presentation, so you guys were my guinea pigs. The topic, I like that topic, and I will continue on my Johnny Appleseed way, spreading the news of. It shocks me as now I look at Civil War books with a different eye. And every book I look at, I say, whoa, that cover of, the supposed grave of General Beauregard, or that cover showing Lincoln and McClellan, that would be a perfect place to use that cover as an illustration in this book. And it is not used in the historical community. It's not a reference people are aware of. So one thing I'm doing is preaching, as it were, to the stamp side that it has historical value. But the other thing I'm doing is preaching to the history side. You need to pay more attention to these things because they tell you stuff just like a soldier diary does, or entry in the official records. And you need to be aware of this historical resource.
We always appreciate new members, and we'd love to help them. Yeah, that's what I tell the history people all the time. We're doing the same thing you are. It's just we have little pieces of paper. We have paper trails everywhere, and it's a lot of the same work.
Back in the 70s, this insight is an absolute truism now. There was a student here at Gettysburg College, William Frazanito, and he traipsed around the battlefield and found these old pictures and, you know, would identify, say, oh, look, that rock with the crease in it is in the background of this photo. So this photograph of these 6 dead men was taken right here because there's that rock in the back. And these 6 photos are all the same group of people because you can see as the cameraman moves the camera position, how the position of that rock moves. He invented the field of photographics. His insight was somewhat the same as mine, that these aren't just illustrations. They're historic documents. And now there are institutes of Civil War photographic studies, and there's a magazine of photographic studies of the Civil War. I don't think my insight is on the level of his in terms of importance, but I do think it is the same side of the street, that it's a historic resource that the historic community hasn't really recognized.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'm going to close.
So anyway,
you do have a thank you here, and George de Cornfield said he's going to go buy your book later. So got
terrific.
at least one sale out of that. That's good. We always like to support,
music to my ears.
Support the writers. Thank you very much again, and everybody, I'll keep you informed of our future presentations. Appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
All right.